Hi everyone, and I want to begin by saying Sanibonani. Sanibonani in Zulu means I see you. And I want to extend in particular to my brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers in the Gadigal nation, Sanibonani from the Zulu nation. So my art form is storytelling. And so if art is everywhere, then I cannot express to you how everywhere stories are. I'm talking about the kind of first-person stories told by regular people, the kind of stories you encounter on non-Kardashian reality shows and podcasts, the types of stories told in TED Talks and on live stages, the kind of stories that simply aren't told through films or in books or on stages, the kinds of stories that are simply spoken out loud. These days, you cannot take 2 steps without bumping into someone, like me, who calls themselves a storyteller. You can't be online for 2 seconds without coming across a story of some kind. So what I want to do is talk about these everyday stories and how they are changing in the digital era and what their everywhereness means for audiences and for those of us who say that we love stories. So some statistics. According to the Nielsen Institute, the average Australian spends 96 hours and 15 minutes online every month. That's about 6 hours and 13 minutes a day. A full 40% of our waking lives are being spent online, which is deeply depressing. But having advocated for the art of storytelling by everyday people for the last decade of my life, the optimist in me wants to see this as an opportunity. Imagine how many stories you can download in 6 hours and 13 minutes. But I confess, my concern outweighs my optimism. As stories are increasingly told and shared online, there is this tendency for storytelling to be seen as an individualized experience, shorn of its roots as a communal activity, a mode of teaching and learning. I often tell my storytellers that storytelling is in fact the oldest app for teaching. Stories are, of course, entertaining, and there's nothing wrong with that. Entertainment is good. Art is for entertainment as well. But stories, the kinds that we encounter every day, when we are in the business of living with and alongside one another in the messy, smelly, dirty world, they are so much more than entertainment. Stories represent the art of living. So, what happens when stories take the form of audio files or video clips, shareable and clickable? Part of what happens is that it makes it easier for some of us to avoid the messiness of real-life interactions. We can be experts in other people without ever leaving the comfort of our own homes. It means that we can fetishize and commodify stories. So the story becomes the product, and the storyteller, a mere producer of that unit. When I first started working with people to help them to shape their stories, which is much of what I do these days, not so much in front of the camera these days, I didn't fully understand this distinction between the storyteller and the story, between the person telling the story and the voice. We love to talk about the voice. Let's elevate the voices of people of color. Let's elevate the voices of women. And what that means is we talk about a voice disconnected from the actual person. But then I met this woman called Askala, and I've asked Askala permission to talk about her today. And she changed the way that I thought about stories. So Askala was this Ethiopian woman. She was in her late 40s when I met her, and she had been living in Perth for almost 30 years by that time. We were working together on this project. So every month we had this event called Food for Thought. Food for Thought was a gathering around a table. We would invite a community into the office. They would cook for us on a Thursday once a month, and then we would have a spread. And it would be used as an occasion to talk about the community that people were from. So it was a Vietnamese feast, or it'd be a Sri Lankan feast, whatever the case may be. So we decided to have an Ethiopian feast, and it was an opportunity to use the sales of those tickets for the meal to raise funds for refugees from that particular community. So it was a gorgeous, thing. The office would be smelling of food. It was very easy to be distracted on a Thursday afternoon. So I sat down with a scholar a few weeks before the event, and I listened to her because my role was essentially to help the storyteller to shape their story. So what are you going to talk about? How are we going to present this to everybody? So I sat down with a scholar and listened as she talked through what she wanted to say. We have this long blue couch in the office, and we sat together on that couch. And she got to a certain point in her story, and she started to cry. So then I started to cry. So then we took a break, and I said, it's okay, we can continue this next week. Next week, she comes back, and she starts sharing the story, and we get to this point in the story, and she starts to cry, and then I start to cry. And I was like, wait, it's okay, we'll do it next week. And now we are literally running out of time, and all we have done is cry. So I said to her, okay, Askala, remind me again, why are we telling this story? Like, why have we chosen this particular story? And she said through tears, because Aussies always want to know where you're from. They expect me to talk about my journey. And she was right, of course. There is this expectation that refugees are going to tell refugee stories. Black people are going to tell Black stories. As if refugees don't fall in love, don't have hilarious and outrageous stories of getting drunk. God forbid. So I asked her what she wanted to talk about. Like, if you had your choice and people didn't expect you to tell this particular story of how you came to Australia, what would you talk about? And she told me. She told me the story about how when she was growing up in Ethiopia, Ethiopian New Year was this huge event. It was like the biggest thing on the calendar. Ethiopians are part of the Coptic Christian Church, one of the oldest churches in the world, so much like the Greek Orthodox Church. And so every year, the Ethiopian New Year is celebrated around September. It's in a different part of the year from the Greek Roman calendar. And so every year, her mom would spend weeks and weeks getting ready for this event. And there would be lots of excitement. And every year, on the morning of the event, her father would get up and he would give her this perfume, and she would act like she was surprised, even though it was the same perfume that he gave her the year before. And she would say, oh, for me? And then she would open it up and she would spritz it on all the kids, and then he would say, woman, are you trying to tell me that you're gonna waste that perfume? You think I got this from the river down the street? And she would say, oh, I'm so sorry. And the kids would giggle like it was the first time they'd ever heard that joke. So it's a beautiful story. The crowd was delighted and charmed. And instead of hearing something they had heard many, many times before, what they got was a picture of warmth and humor and love, a portrait of everything that she had left behind. Importantly, she chose to tell a story that she could tell without hurting herself. The price of admission when you start a new life in a country should not include repeatedly baring your soul and injuring yourself in order to satisfy other people's curiosity. I tell this story for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it is a beautiful example of one of the first principles of storytelling, which is to tell your story from your scars and not from your wounds. The place where she kept getting stuck, that was still a wound. It was still open, still very sore, even though decades had passed. The parts of her story that made her cry are none of my business. Storytelling is not therapy. But I began to see that my primary responsibility was to help her to protect herself. And this has become a core part of my work as a storyteller. My job isn't so much craft about the story arc and the narrative structure. It is about helping people figure out what they won't say, what they will keep to themselves and for themselves, not out of shame, but out of judiciousness, out of a respect for boundaries in a time when there seem to be fewer and fewer spaces in which we belong only to ourselves or to those few with whom we decide to share stories in the intimacy of a close circle. My job is to say, some stories are for everyone, and some stories are not. What category does this story fall into? In other words, my job is to help storytellers to think about the politics of stories and how to ensure that they can control their own narratives, no matter how big or how small the story is that they choose to share. The potential to share stories digitally is immense. I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe in it. But it is essential that as we celebrate stories, we remember that stories belong in the bodies of real people. Those of us who are in the business of putting stories into the public realm, we have to remember that if stories are everywhere, then so too are the artists who live those stories into existence. It is really very simple. If we take care of the storyteller, the stories will take care of themselves and they will multiply. Thank you.